my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Tonight we are going to be reading creepypastas. Since we've been doing a lot of true stories lately, I thought maybe some creepypastas would be a nice change, actually. So please sit back and relax and enjoy the creepypastas that put you to sleep. These are some of the winners from different years. That's how I picked them out. Some are from Reddit, while others are from Wiki. Are no sleep. Hi, CIA herpes. My wife drowned our son in the bathtub. Now I know why. I remember coming into the house on one cold winter's night. The snow and ice blew through the front door as I stepped into the house. Kicking my boots clean, I noticed a strange odor in the place. It almost smelled like stink bugs with notes of copper and bleach. I hated the smell of stink bugs. Hey honey, I said, where are you? I'm starving. And by the way, it smells weird in here. Traffic nearly stopped for half an hour on I-80. A goddamn tractor trailer flipped over in the middle of a blizzard and closed down all 3 lanes. We could only get around by driving in the breakdown lane until the cops got there and started. My voice trailed away as I noticed the drops of blood on the floor leading from the front hallway into the kitchen. I stopped talking immediately. I looked around for signs of an intruder. I saw nothing. No smashed windows, no busted doors, no rifled through drawers or cabinets. Oh my God, I whispered, immediately going into the kitchen and grabbing the largest meat cleaver I could find from the knife block. Its edges gleamed, freshly sharpened and ready to slice into the hardest of flesh. I made sure not to step on the drops of blood. I didn't want to disturb a crime scene, if indeed it was a crime scene. I stopped, thinking of calling 911, but some inner voice urged me on. It will take 5 or 6 minutes for the police to arrive, possibly longer. My voice said, and you need to check on your family right now. Sprinting forwards, I followed the blood trail, down the hall and straight to the first floor bathroom. The door stood closed. I tried the handle and found it locked. Hello, I said, pounding on the door. Who's in there? Open up. Isaac, is that you? A faint voice asked. I recognized the voice of my wife immediately. Rising waves of anxiety and adrenaline coursed through my body, and I immediately knew something was very wrong. I could hear it in the dead tone of my wife's voice. See it glistening on the floor in crimson droplets. Feel it in the air like falling pressure before a thunderstorm. Jenna, open the door. I heard some slight shuffling in the bathroom, like someone dragging themselves across the floor. Then I heard a click, a click, a click. I opened the door and found a chamber of nightmares lying beyond the threshold. My only son floated face down in the bathtub. My wife sat back down on the edge of the tub, rocking back and forth, her eyes flat and dead. Why? I whispered, horrified. Why did you do this? Why would you do this? Don't you know? She mumbled in a creaky voice. Do you really not know that our son is the anarchist? Maybe I did have a suspicion that something wasn't quite right with Max. It was more than dead animals I keep finding strewn around the yard and under the house. It was more than the way his eyes seemed to shine in the dark when I wished him good night. No, it was a feeling, a cold, empty feeling that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He had no friends at school, and animals avoided him like the plague. Dogs would start barking and howling when he walked down the street. Cats hissed, then disappeared with a swish of their tail in a flash, behind bushes or up trees. These things on their own wouldn't be much evidence of anything really, but they were far from the only evidence that Max was unusual. A month ago, a couple boys had tried to bully Max at school. They ran out of the bathroom where it happened, crying, wetting their pants as blood streamed from their noses and ears. They wouldn't tell anyone what happened, and Max just kept smiling and staring at them with his large black eyes. The school called an ambulance and the doctors were baffled. They had to sit in the emergency room for 3 hours before the blood stopped pouring out of their bodies. They were white as sheets by the time it finally clotted, and the doctors had no idea of the cause. The 2 boys went missing a few days later. The case ended up drawing media attention. The FBI came in but found absolutely nothing. It seemed like the boys just disappeared out their windows, and then their trail immediately went cold. Tracking dogs couldn't find any hint of a trail. It was as if they had teleported from their bedrooms. Moreover, no neighbors had seen a thing. A couple of months later, a few hikers found the boys' fingers growing out of a tree on the Appalachian Trail over 50 miles away. The FBI swooped in and used DNA testing to determine that these fingers belonged to the missing boys from Max's school. No one ever explained how the rotting fingers had become quite literally fused into the tree. No one ever tried to bully Max again after that. In fact, the other kids gave him as much distance as possible. I tried to watch Max when he didn't know I was looking. He was only an 8-year-old boy, but he could put on masks like a psychopath and charm nearly anyone he met. As soon as they turned away, though, he would scowl and narrow his eyes, as if he wanted to stab them in the back. By the way, this is my son after all. I loved him, and I think he loved me in his own strange way. Even my wife said she loved him, and she claims that's why she had to kill him. A strange kind of love, I admit. But I don't think she's lying. I think she did love him, and she feared what would happen when his ascension had finished, and he sat on a throne of bones, crushing out the lives of millions of people with an iron heart. She feared the consequences for him. She said only for him, and she loved him. And so she had to kill him and stop it now before it grew into a grinding juggernaut that devoured his soul and sent him to hell. "Are you my true father?" Max had asked me that morning as I sat at the kitchen table. I put down my cup of coffee very slowly. My hands, I noticed, were shaking. I then turned and looked at my son. Yes, of course, I said with a trembling voice. "Why would you ask such a crazy question?" He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes so dark they looked completely black. They blazed with an inner light, a fire or something. His pale white skin looked as smooth as a statue's, and dark hair fell over his chiseled features. If it weren't for his aloofness and cruelty, he would have been a very beautiful boy. Instead, he radiated a coldness like the moon, an aura that gave light but no heat. A kind of reptilian psychopath detachment that extended to everything he did. Max would laugh when he saw fatal car accidents on the highway, or heard the news report about wars and murders. "I don't think you are my true father," Max said, still staring at me, reading me like a book. I felt myself begin to sweat. "Max, that's ridiculous," I said. "Your mother and I have been married." "Then where does my power come from?" he asked. "Why do I possess what you never will?" "I know I'm related to Mother." He spat out the word as if it were a filthy thing. "Mother. But you." "I know not. I know not where my divinity comes from. You seem weak and foolish to me. At least Mother has the courage to admit she hates me. You grovel and pretend, and then when my back is turned, you sneer at me and my ascension. I know you do. You're a last man like so many others." You're kind as ineradicable as fleas, hopping all over the world without a meaning or the will to power. You don't understand someone like me. You never could understand someone like me. Not in a million years, Daddy. I don't understand what all this business about ascension is, I said. I think you're living in a fantasy world. Oh, Daddy, if I were living in a fantasy world, then the fruit would not be revealed. But it will be. Soon, everyone will see, including you. I'll be with my true father and become the absolute king of this world. Small men like you will grovel like worms at my feet. They'll be crushed under my weight as I rise to heights previously undreamed of as part of my becoming. My greatness will shine like a second sun. People will remember my name with awe and terror for 1,000 years. He spoke like a much older boy. All I could do was gawk at him with an open mouth. He had a faraway look in his eyes, a fanatical gleam that sharpened his cold features. I remembered when Max was just a little boy. Did I know back then, when I watched him playing with his toys? Did I know what he was? I think I would have run screaming from the room if I had. Max turned and left the room, grabbing his backpack as the school bus pulled up in front of the house. I watched him go. He walked with the confidence and straight back of a soldier, and yet I thought I saw an aura of swirling black shadows around him. I blinked and, like mist, under the hot summer sun, I saw it dissolve into thin air. I looked away, sweating and shaking. With trembling hands, I tried to pick up the coffee cup. It immediately fell to the floor in my nervous fingers and shattered into 1,000 pieces. 50 minutes later, I was working from home when the first of the ambulances and police cars raced by, heading to Max's school. My neighbor, a teacher at the school, who the kids call Mr. Allen, told me the story from his viewpoint later that day. I don't know how much I believe. At the time, maybe none of it. Now I believe all of it. The day started normally enough, Mr. Allen said, pushing his oversized glasses up his long, nerdy face. The kids started screaming in from homeroom. Then the bell rang. I started prepping my lecture notes for first period. That was when the screaming started from down the hallway. It sounded like a girl being murdered. Just an endless pain, a shrieking that went on and on and on. Abruptly it cut off and everything went deathly silent. The students all looked at each other nervously. A hissing voice came over the intercom, a reptilian voice that made my skin crawl. It started talking and I immediately knew it wasn't human, and yet it sounded just like Max. I mean, he's been in my class for years. Isn't that weird? It was like someone had taken his voice and ran it through a synthesizer too deep in it and slow it down. I heard weird hissing breaths as he spoke. "Hello, friends," the voice whispered, yet the words boomed through every classroom and hallway. "We have a very special planned day for you. The activities are already prepared and the festivities will now begin. Don't try to escape now. That breaks the rules. The first of the sheep have already been slaughtered. Good luck." I figured some hoodlum had snuck into the office and somehow used the intercom while the secretary was out getting a cup of coffee or using the bathroom. I put my hands up as the class began to chatter, trying to calm them down. Kids, I said, "it's clearly just a prank. Please calm down." Then the classroom door flew open and a girl came running inside, covered in blood from head to toe. She had deep slices across the back of her head, her forehead, her right cheek, and right arm. Large, fetid drops of blood fell beside her as she ran, as if leaving breadcrumbs to find her way back. The wounds on her body changed colors in front of her eyes, turning purple, then black. Necrotic tissue began to spread and die within moments. Black blood streamed from the wounds. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but only a choke. Gasping came out. Something had infested the girl. I could see it. I quickly backed away, feeling like it was a dream. "Please, oh God, please help," she whispered. Whimpering, her legs buckling, she fell to her knees. The kids in the classroom began to scream. "Please, someone help. Help me. Help me." Her voice grew louder, then her skin paler as the purplish, dying patches of tissue spread. She opened her mouth and began to vomit some foul, oily sludge. It hurts, she moaned, falling into the puddle of vomit. "Isn't someone going to help me?" I ran to her side. I didn't know this girl. She wasn't in any of my classes, you see. But I immediately knew she needed medical attention. "What happened?" I asked. "Who did this?" She got close to my ear and whispered, "There's things in the hallways that shouldn't exist," she said, still whimpering. She coughed up more blood and black fluid, rolling onto her back afterwards and breathing hard, her chest pumping up and down, her eyelids fluttered and her skin went white. I thought she was losing consciousness until her eyes rolled back in her head, and she sat up grinning. Claws began to rip out of her fingers. Black tears streamed down her face, and that dark sludge dripped from her mouth like disease drops of saliva. Her body lengthened, and her arms and legs broke and twisted. I could hear the bones snapping like tree branches during a winter storm. I watched the transformation in horror. breaking away. The other kids were all screaming and streaming to the back of the classroom. This girl hissed as black veins appeared all around her face and neck. She rose and walked towards the scared children in the back of the room. Her movements as smooth as a synchronized dancer's, jerky and twisted. Nightmarish in their own way, but what came next was far worse. Her body grew taller, thinner, and emaciated as it stretched up to the ceiling, towering over all the other kids in the class. She must have grown to at least 8 feet by that point. Her arms reached out, the bone-white claws sharpening as she struck out at the screaming row of children in front. I saw drops of blood splash against the back wall, and a couple boys stumbled forward, their throats slashed wide open. Their panic-stricken faces grew pale and bloodless as they choked and tried to scream, but only bubbling gasps came out. I saw the window was open, and I was on the first floor. I decided to run to try to get help. I knew we needed policemen and medics at the scene, and I couldn't do anything to save the kids. Well, to be honest, I felt like shit about it, but I did run as the screams followed me from the back of the classroom. I jumped right out the window and ran across the playground, scaled the fence, but as I went, I heard a strange, shrill laughter coming from the intercom. And you know what? I'm positive the voice sounded just like Max. Max came home early from school that day, grinning and laughing. He was in a fine mood. I don't know what happened after the teacher left or how many people died in that building of horrors, but I know Max caused it all. The first broadening steps in the path of the ascension, the foundational layer to his throne of bones. Mr. Allen had talked to Jenna earlier that morning, immediately after running home from that den of nightmares, and she had already put a plan into motion. When Max arrived at home from school, she gave him Gatorade with a large amount of fentanyl she had purchased from a random drug dealer in the inner city, dissolved inside the orange liquid. She added some more sugar to mask any slight bitterness and gave it to the grinning boy with large black pupils like smoldering coals. He drank it quickly, looking at her the whole time with his dilated eyes. He smiled and got up, but soon afterwards collapsed. Jenna found him unconscious in his bedroom and dragged him to the bathroom. She filled the tub and held Max underwater until, the bubbles stopped. As my wife explained it all to me, a sense of loss and horror came over me. I didn't know if I missed Max or not. His swollen face was blue. Without a doubt, he was dead. I took my wife outside and sat her down at the table, debating whether I should call the police. No one had ever told me what to do in this situation, and I felt like I was flying blind. I got up, I went to the oven and started brewing some instant coffee. Footsteps rustled behind me. I turned around to see Max, seemingly alive and well, but also changed in some fundamentally disturbing way. His eyes fully black now, he hovered inches above the ground behind my wife, smiling at me. His teeth seemed much sharper and longer than before. A feeling of electricity sizzled in the air. I could see some sort of expansive black aura rippling around his pale skin, dark and cold as empty space. Goosebumps rose on my body just from being near that sticky, sickly, dark aura. The water pot began to boil behind me. Behind Max, I saw the strange, mutilated children from the school creep out of the front hallway. 4 or 5 of them skittered about with emaciated, twisted legs bending in ways no human leg should bend. Their heads nearly scraped at the low ceiling in the kitchen. Their pale, broken arms reached down to their knees, jointed in myriad areas. I could hear the soft crackling of bones now as they slowly moved forward, a slight snapping sound like small twigs broken underfoot. Their blank white eyes constantly trembled beneath tears that stained their bleached, bloodless skin. Mother, Max said condescendingly, sounding like a disappointed parent. You should have known that you cannot kill me except by decapitation or by burning my body. Do you think my true father would let a worthless louse like yourself kill me before my ascension to the throne? Are you that foolish and blind? Jenna began to cry, refusing to look at her son. But I respect your courage and action. For that, I will give you a quick death. He looked straight at me, which is something you will not receive, my fake father. You are weak, worthless coward, and you deserve to die slow, screaming death. So, your voice is so hoarse from all the pleading you would be doing for me to spare you. For so do the screams of the weak sound as beautiful symphony to the ears of my true father and myself. The deaths of the weak will pave the road to a new world. He motioned to the mutilated children behind them. Their bodies had become so twisted and contorted that I couldn't tell whether they had been boys or girls. They looked only like monsters now, walking corpses. In a blur, one of them ran forward and grabbed my wife's head. A scream bubbled in my throat as I watched. But it was over. Before I even knew what was happening. The thing used its crooked clawed fingers to twist her head, snapping her neck in a second. Jenna's face was now looking straight behind her, the skin on her neck spiraling around in sickly folds. On her broken flesh, I saw burst blood vessels that rapidly spread, purple bruises all over. She gave a death gasp, releasing an endless choking breath, her eyelids fluttering and fingers twitching. Then she was still, completely still. Max gave a slow, deep laugh, a grating sound that seemed to rise up from the depths of his withered soul. His black eyes flashed with amusement and pleasure. Max grinned, his fabric teeth shining and white. reflecting the cold winter sunlight streaming in from the window. The water pot began to whistle as increasing torrents of steam poured out of it. Without hesitation, I spun and grabbed it, flicking open the spout by pressing the button on the handle. Then I flung it at Max, the boiling hot water flying out of it in a spiraling stream as the metal water pot circled through the air. It all seemed to happen as if in slow motion. I saw Mac's look of triumph and amusement morphed into a scowl of hatred and anger, but the motion had been so quick and accurate that he couldn't have moved in time. The heavy metal pot smacked him in the face, spilling scalding hot water all over his face and neck. He screamed and fell back, knocking over the mutated bodies of the children he had turned into his mindless followers. I sprinted towards the door without looking back, heading outside. The constant stream of police and ambulance sirens headed to the school had stopped. Now dozens of black SUVs streamed into town. Men in dark suits with mirrored sunglasses stepped out of the cars. I looked back to the house and saw a few of the new arrivals running in with automatic rifles. Others headed to neighbors' houses, breaking down doors and entering without knocking. I heard rifles firing and hoarse, gurgling screams. The mutated children ran out of my house, their bodies riddled with bullets. They slowly lost energy as black blood streamed out of multiple giant exit wounds eaten into their bodies. They eventually fell down on the streets and died with a rasping breath. But they never found Max. They quarantined the town and went from house to house, building to building, searching for the source of all this death and evil. But he had somehow escaped. They killed all the mutilated fanatics they could find. But the bodies of many children from the school seem unaccounted for. I knew where they had gone. They had followed Max, fanatical soldiers for his new army, fearless of death, committed to their leader and his new world order. I don't know where Max went or where he'll show up next, but I know he is moving towards his ascension. And the next time I see him, he'll arrive in power and glory and crush out the lives of millions of people under his feet. Story number 2. Bye. J.L. Goodwin, 1990, or No Sleep. I took a drive late one night. What happened will haunt me for the rest of my life. Oh, before I forget, man, I was wondering if you could help me with something. The cashier, an acne-riddled kid who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s, looked up from shoving the bag of potato chips, 2 sodas, and a bag of Lucky Strikes into a plastic bag. For a moment, he just stood there, seemingly frozen in mid-action. Then he finally answered, "Yeah, what's up, man?" I let out a barely perceptible sigh. I'd been half afraid that I would be told to take a long walk off a short pier, but to put it politely, feeling relieved, I reached into my back pocket for what was there. You see, I seem to have, well, sort of gotten lost out here. I decided to take a late night drive and ended up getting turned around in all these 2-lane back roads. I unfolded the map and set it on the counter so he and I could both see it before continuing. So I was hoping you could point out here roughly where we are. But more importantly, the way to get back to the main road. There was another long stretch of silence, and then the kid began to laugh. Softly at first, and then louder. Dude, a paper map? Really? He managed out between wheezes. Are you for real? What year do you think this is? 1993? For my part, I simply let out a resigned sigh. I had a bad feeling I would be getting this sort of reaction from someone his age, and it looked like I'd been proven right. Can't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped tears from the corners of his eyes and looked at me. Seriously, bro? Don't you have a GPS in your car or something? He asked. Immediately, I hooked a thumb over my shoulder, pointing out the glass entry door at the beige sedan sitting at the gas pumps. Not in a Honda Accord from 1979, I replied simply. As he looked behind me, out the door, I could see he wanted to make another quip. Probably something about how I should buy a newer car. Thankfully, though, he kept it to himself. Instead, he leaned over at the map and, still chuckling softly to himself, began to look at it. A few moments later, he snapped his fingers. I still got it, he said proudly, then pushed his finger down near the middle of the map and looked up at me. Dude, we're right about here, roughly 6 or 7 miles outside Placer. I leaned over the counter to see as he drew his finger away. Here? He nodded, and I pulled a pen out of my pocket, circling the area as a reminder once I left, and then examined the map further. Okay, so it seems I could take more than a few roads to get back to the Interstate 5, right? The kid nodded again, clearly bored with the unusual interaction by the slightly annoyed look which he had begun to cross his face. Sure, he said simply, then placed my bagged items on top of the map. That'll be $14.50 for this and $28.50 for the gas. I reached into my pocket and pulled my wallet out, withdrawing 3 20s and handing them to him. The register let out its trademark ding as it shot open, and he placed the bills in it before pulling out and handing me my change. Placing it and my wallet back into my pocket, I picked up the bag and folded the map back up. Thanks for the help, I said as I turned to head out the door. Yeah, no problem, man, I heard him mutter as I crossed the door and pushed it open. A small bell hung from the inside handle jingled as I stepped outside and let the door swing shut behind me. The sounds of the refrigerators humming and the fluorescent lights softly buzzing was replaced by those of a summertime forest at night. Crickets and cicadas buzzed loudly in the grass around the store, almost overwhelming the buzzing sound of lights over the sound of an owl hooting loudly echoed through the trees, followed by the loud call of what had to be an elk. I inhaled the clean air before heading down the steps from my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the driver's seat. "So did you find out where you were?" asked a voice from the passenger seat. For a split second, a wave of confusion and panic swept over me, and I spun in my seat. I was immediately replaced by a wave of embarrassment, amplified as my friend began to let out a deep laugh. "Dude, you were in there that long that you forgot I was out here waiting for you?" Not wanting to admit I had done just that, I shook my head. "Nah, bro, not that, just dealing with the kid in there was a major headache." He nodded sympathetically. Craig was one of my closest friends. Ever since we met each other, we'd immediately clicked and had stuck with each other from that point on. And one thing we both loved to do was take late night drives to nowhere, simply driving around with no destination in mind, listening to the radio and occasionally sharing a joint one of us would buy. This is the first time we've ever gotten lost, though. I reached into the bag and pulled out the bottle of Mr. Pibb and handing it to him. "Here," I said, simply before pulling the Lucky Strikes out and chucking the rest into the seat in the back. Pulling the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and turned it on. The car's buzzer sounded as the dash lights came on. A moment later, the inline four quietly rumbled to life and its traditional purple. Tearing open the packaging, I pulled a cigarette from the pack and stuck it into the corner of my mouth before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a glance back towards the store and froze. A small shiver shot down my spine as I realized the kid was standing at the door, staring out at us. What the actual hell? Craig caught my gaze and turned to look himself. "Dude, what the hell is his problem?" I shook my head as the lighter popped back out, signaling it was ready to use. I pushed the glowing red coil against the tip of the smoke for a moment until it was lit. Then I placed it back in its slot. I pulled it from my lips and exhaled a cloud of smoke before answering, feeling more than a bit unnerved. I don't know, but honestly, man, that's more than a bit creepy. I shot one more glance. The kid hadn't even blinked. He was just staring with an off-putting intensity out the glass. "Come on, let's get the hell out of here," Greg said, echoing the thoughts swimming through my mind. I put the car into first gear and eased off the clutch. The car began to roll forward out of the corner of my eye. I saw him turn and shoot the bird at the kid as we slid out from under the lights into the dark. "Prick," I heard him mumble. I turned the car left and began heading back the way we came. The good thing is I did find out where we were. I pulled the map from my pocket and handed it to my friend. I heard him fumbling for a moment, and then a small flashlight clicked on as he aimed it at the map. "Dude, how did we make it almost as far east as Placer?" he asked with a slightly astonished tone. "I don't know, longer drive than normal, I guess," I answered, rolling down my window to flick the I shot a glance at the analog clock on the dashboard. 2:45 it read. I let out a small sigh. Great, Vanessa's likely worrying up a storm about us right now. Me especially. Ever since we started dating 5 years ago, my girlfriend had always been rather apprehensive about my habit of taking long, late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. She always feared I'd get into an accident, either with another car, wrap my hands around my Honda around a tree, or hit an animal. Most of the time, I'd come home to find her sitting up waiting for me, worry clearly etched into her beautiful sapphire eyes. I bit my lips slightly. Hey, do you think I should text Vanessa and let her know we're okay? I asked Greg. I heard him let out a snort. Honestly, bro, no. I know the woman loves you to death, and I'm happy she cares so much, but she's got to learn you know what you're doing. Plus, you need space from her. It's not healthy how much time you two spend together. I flicked the remnants of the cigarette out the window and let out a snort of my own. It's called being in love, dude. You should try it sometime, I joked, causing him to let out a laugh. Nah, thanks. I enjoy being single way too much. Shaking my head, I stared out the windshield as the headlights guided our way. I felt a slight sense of unease creep up into me as I watched the 2-lane road stretch out before us. The moon in the sky, almost completely blocked by the trees over our heads. I hadn't seen another car on the road for 2 hours at least. Oh, what do you expect, Derek? You drove into the boonies. There's only ghost towns out here. Why don't you try driving all the way to Idaho next time? Shaking my thoughts away, I fumbled into the center console for a moment before pulling out a mixtape. A bit of music would help me feel better. I pushed it into the car's cassette player and hit play. A moment later, the pounding bass and synths of Dance in the Dead House began blasting from the speakers. Craig let out a whoop of excitement. Dude, yes, that's the kind of tunes we need for a drive like this. He rolled down the passenger window, sticking out his head from the window to whoop, holler into the night. I shook my head, unable to keep from grinning at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The playful mood helped me settle my mind, and I felt myself relax into the seat. The tension flowing out of my body and out the window. For a few minutes, that's how things went. The road stretching out ahead of us, and then disappearing into the blackness behind. The music blasting out from the radio and the soft roar of the engine in the background. I shot another look at the backlit clock. Now it read 5 minutes to 3. We should be at the highway in any minute. The thought released the last wisps of tension in my body and fumbled into the back seat for the bottle. Catching it with the tips of my finger, I pulled my bottle of soda from it and holding the bottle to the steering wheel, cracked the cap. I lifted it to my lips and took a swig, taking my eyes off the road for a split second to tilt my head back. I looked back at the road and I nearly spit out all of the windshield. In the second I'd stopped looking, a figure had stepped out onto the road. Well, what the hell, I shouted, jamming my feet on the brake and clutched as hard as I could. The rear wheels of the car locked up and the ear-piercing sound of squealing tires filled the cabin. horror, the tail end of the car began sliding out. Oh, hell no, 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 no. For a few seconds, the world around us became a blur of shapes and colors, and I feared at any moment we'd smash into a tree or begin rolling. Thankfully, the car finally came to a stop, with a screech of protest from the suspension. We were facing back the way we had come. I could tell from the black lines on the road, which had once been the rubber of my tires. I gripping the steering wheel with a death grip, my heart furiously pounding in my chest. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps. There was no movement in the car for a few seconds before Craig reached forward and snapped the music off. Dude, what the fuck? He shouted at me, his face looking as pale as mine must be. I didn't say a word to him. Not a single word. Instead, I pulled up on the handbrake, ripped off my seatbelt, and practically kicked the door open, stepping out into the pavement. I stepped to the front of the car on unsteady legs until I was squarely in between the headlights' beam. I looked around, first at the road and then at the forest on either side. There was nothing there. What the? I turned and looked behind me over the roof of the car. The red glow of the taillights illuminated a few feet ahead, but beyond that, nothing but blackness. I turned again, looking out at the darkness beyond the branches. No movement disturbed the bushes and branches, and aside from the quiet hum of the car's engine, everything was silent. I shook my head. Did I just imagine things? I shook it again. No. I knew for a fact I didn't hallucinate. There was someone there. The sound of the car door opened, creaked as Craig got out. Leaving the door open, he immediately came over to me. You have exactly 20 seconds to explain to me what the hell just happened before I lose it, bro, he exclaimed. For a second, I fought to find my voice. Then I answered, someone. I'm not crazy. Someone stepped out of the woods onto the road. It looked like a chick. I thought I was going to freaking hit her. I realized I'd been holding in a breath and let it out, trying desperately to get myself to relax. Craig gave me a confused look. Are you serious, man? I nodded. He pulled the flashlight he'd used to look at the map from his pocket and flicked it on, aiming it first at the tree line on one side of the road, then the other. After doing this a few times, he turned back to me. Well, whoever it was, they're not there anymore. His brow furrowed. But why would a chick be out here in the middle of nowhere? He muttered, more to himself than me. I still answered, I don't know. It's freaking Josephine country. For as many good people live out here, there's also a bunch of weirdos. I heard my friend let out a snort of laughter in reply, but something had caught my attention, a feeling which had slammed into me with all the weight of a Peterbilt. The feeling of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I spun around, looking back towards the car and seeing nothing there, but the feeling remained in it. I didn't like it one bit, especially when the feeling came again, at this time from the direction I'd been facing a moment ago. Realization dawned on me, and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, along with a flicker of fear. Oh shit, I whispered. Greg turned to look at me. What? Yeah, seeing the look on my face, he repeated, what? I looked up at him, speaking with a bit of weak voice. We need to get back in the car right now. And Craig didn't argue. Thankfully, he was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched intensified, as if someone was rapidly approaching from the woods. Oh hell, I broke first into a run, then a full-out sprint for the last 10 feet, tearing at the door handle and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door closed behind me, I jammed down on the door lock, seeing Greg do the same. He turned to me, his face hidden in the dark, but his voice giving a perfect mental image of it. What the hell was that? The tone of it gave away the fact he'd felt, even for the briefest of moments, the same feeling of dread I'd feared I had. You remember those videos of people driving on empty roads in the middle of the night, only to have someone step into the road and get them to stop? I asked. A sharp intake of breath came from the passenger seat before he answered, finishing my thought, and then a bunch of people spring out of the woods, trying to ambush them. Oh, hell no. My thoughts exactly. Time to friggin' leave. I released the parking brake, pulling up my seat on my seatbelt and jammed the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a sigh of relief. Just for an instant. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. I think we're in the clear, man. Craig let out a soft laugh. Thanks for that, I nodded, then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig. The still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I set on to a laugh of my own. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this I may take a bit of a break from late night drives. This just got under my skin too much. For a few moments longer than I thought, there was nothing, and then he answered. As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand. No problem at all. I could detect a small tone of sadness in his voice, along with something else I couldn't place. But then I heard him sit up straight. Hey, Jake, he asked, a bit of concerned tone now etched into it. Yeah? I heard him draw another breath. Shouldn't we be to the highway by now? Or at least see the lights of passing cars? I hadn't been fully concentrating on anything except the next stretch of road and my headlights. But at his words, I jerked my head to look beyond them. What the actual hell? He was right. The lights of cars and trucks flashing by on the freeway should be visible through the darkness. I clearly remember looking in my side view mirror as we turned onto the road from the highway, seeing the ever-present white and red glows zipping by both ways at the same distance we were now. But that wasn't the case anymore. All I could see in front of us was darkness. Darkness in the woods on either side of the road. For a moment I lifted my foot off the accelerator, letting the car slow down a little as my brain whirled. He's gotta be mistaken. Hell, I've gotta be mistaken. We just haven't gotten close enough to the highway yet. You know these old roads, Derek. They often end up longer than they look on the map. Feeling somewhat relieved by that thought, I said it out loud to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced, and for that matter, as much as I repeated it mentally to myself, I couldn't completely convince myself either. It was as if I was seeing the woman stepped into the road had shaken me more than I'd first thought. Pushing back down on the gas, I shifted into fourth gear and watched the speedometer flirt with 55 miles an hour. For a few minutes more, neither one of us saw anything as we drove in silence, and Greg let out a cry. There, a light. For a moment, a surge of hope welled up inside me. I craned over the steering wheel, looking to see the highway. It was dashed as I saw it, only a street light standing solitary guard on the side of the road like a sentry. Beneath it stood an old worn sign which seemed to have been shot at many times with both BB pellets and actual bullets. I slowed the car, saw him as it came towards us, so I could read what it said. I felt a wave of confusion follow me. Golden, 2 miles. The fuck? Craig breathed out as he read the sign. It passed by us, the street light momentarily bathing the interior of the car in light and showing the confused, worried look on our faces. How the hell did we end up by Golden? Golden is a ghost town which attracts visitors every year to check out the standing buildings. It was a mining town which had a population of a few hundred people, but once the prospects died up in the early to mid-20th century, it became a ghost town, like it is today. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays is being featured on Ghost Adventures a few years back. Craig repeated his question, but I wasn't able to answer. My thoughts were racing inside my head. There's no freaking way. Golden is miles to the north of Placer. There are no roads connecting the two areas from what I saw on the map. Not to mention, we've been driving in a straight line since leaving the gas station. I honestly have no idea, man. I finally answered, my voice conveying how rattled I truly was. In the car's dark interior, I saw him put his head in his hands. I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes, pulling another out with slightly unsteady fingers and pushing it in the cigarette lighter. A moment later, the turn off for the ghost town flashed by on the right. I saw the dark hulking shape of the church's spire rising out of the dark for a moment. Then it was behind us. The lighter popped out and I pressed it to the smoke, lighting it and putting it back. I decided I need to try and calm the rising tension that was filling the car's interior. Look, however we ended up here, man, the fact is we can't be far now from the highway, so let's keep our wits about us. Keep calm. And when we get back to my place, you and me, Vanessa can go have a good laugh over this. Sound good? I heard my friend take a deep breath and then let out a whoosh. Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan. He let out a soft laugh and I felt him pat my shoulder. Thanks, Derek. You are seriously a good friend. Glad I have got you. I nodded, then realized he may not be able to see it in the dark. No problem, man, I said. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed since I'd looked last, and yet I felt more like it'd been 30. Time seems different when you're stressed. For a few minutes, there was only darkness, and then a light appeared in the distance. Ah, there we go, I exclaimed. I waited to see the sign on the ramp appear. I felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by once again. That's what. Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the passenger seat, showing he'd seen it as well. As the street light and sign disappeared behind us, a feeling began to creep up on me. Another shiver shot up my spine as I realized that it was the same feeling I had when we'd gotten out of the car. The feeling of eyes on me. My eyes shifted to the blur of trees on either side of the car, but I saw no one out there. The turn off for the ghost town heard Greg let out another deep breath. "Derek, pull over, please," he said simply. His voice was shaking as much as I didn't want to stop. I did as he asked, pulling over just before the turn-off. Greg ripped off his seatbelt, shoving the door open, and stepped out. I watched him stride to the front of the car and stand there for a minute. He seemed to start shaking a bit, and I realized just how much this was getting to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle when I glanced at the clock and froze. It was still showing 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A feeling of shock and fear washed over me like a wave as I tapped with my fingers to see if it was stuck. But it refused to begin moving again. Okay, what in the actual heck is going on? I whispered to myself, reaching into my pocket, fishing out my phone, turning on the screen. Like the clock, it too showed the time as 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched began to intensify, and I glanced at Greg standing in the dark before looking down, beginning to type text out to Vanessa. "Hey, baby girl, I just wanted to let you know that Greg and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway, but haven't gotten there yet. We got a bit turned around out here. Do me a favor, and if I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? I love you." I replaced the phone in my pocket. I knew I should have been more honest, but I was beginning to feel a little freaked out about the weird situation. I didn't want her to worry any more than necessary, as it would make me start to freak out even worse. Pushing open the door, I got out and walked around, stopping near the right red light. I began to feel a new sensation creep up on me, a potent mix. "Dude, you alright?" I asked him after a moment. He didn't answer, but happily he seemed to have stopped shaking. I repeated my question. When he didn't answer my second and third call, I began to feel a new sensation creeping up on me. A potent mixture of dread and fear. "Greg, dude, you're creeping me out. Please say something." He finally turned and looked at me, and in a semi-glow of the headlights, I saw his face had gone pale. He raised a finger and pointed, saying only a single word. "Look." My eyes followed where he had gestured, and I began to feel like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette dangling from my lips fell from my mouth to the ground. Standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was drenched in gloom, but with a gasp I realized it was the same woman who nearly caused me to wreck. "Oh my God," I swallowed, finding my voice. We should get back in the car." Greg nodded, and almost immediately, "I think you might be right," he answered, his voice wavering. Not taking our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our respective doors and climbed in. I didn't even bother pulling my seatbelt on. I just jammed the gear shifter into first, and I floored it. Dirt and gravel kicked out behind us. The car shot forward onto the road. This time I didn't let up on the gas. I kept my foot hard down, the engine beginning to roar as I shifted into third and then fourth. The speedometer reached 60 as I shifted into fifth, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing second. I prayed I would see something, anything ahead of us. An intersection, a house, a freaking out of use payphone, for God's sake. And then my blood turned to ice as a light appeared ahead of us. The exact same one as before. The sign underneath, my eyes flickered to the clock and the terror me is, again, still frozen at the same time. This isn't good, bro, Greg said from the passenger seat. I agreed. Yeah, I agreed. But I didn't say it out loud. I kept my foot to the floor, the speedometer now hitting 80. The turn-off appeared again, and what I saw made me want to scream. The woman had gotten closer to the road, and she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her, I saw others, the outlines of other people, dozens of them, possibly more. They all stood facing the road, watching us fly by, and then disappeared into the rearview mirror. I breathed out as the light sign and flashed by yet again. This time the mass of people had gotten even closer. The woman stood in front of them all, and for a split second, the headlights illuminated her. Another flash of ice shot through my veins as I saw the river of blood pouring down the front of her nightgown, one that looked to be decades old. What the hell do we do? Greg asked me, his voice steady, yet filled with fear. That's the same way I felt. I just shook my head. I don't know, man. Was all I could say. The street light began to appear again when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, causing me to slam on the brakes in surprise. I fumbled in my pocket for it, seeing Greg look over at me. I texted Vanessa when we stopped, told her to reply back in a few minutes. Now I think I'm gonna call and tell her to call the police or something. He didn't reply, instead turning to look at the windshield at the approaching light. Flicking my eyes from the phone screen to the road and back, I forced myself to not look at the turn-off as we zoomed past the light. I didn't want to see how close those ghosts, demons, whatever they were, had gotten to the road. I flipped my finger, pushing away the lock screen and tapping on the messenger icon. As the light began to appear once more, Vanessa's message automatically opened, and for a moment, relief, like I've never felt, surged through me at the small bit of normalcy I had in my grasp. I froze. I didn't even look up at the road. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the single sentence, reading and rereading it. A wave of confusion passed over me. Enough. I spoke out loud. What the? Greg spoke up. What did you say? I didn't answer him. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to understand, but it was like hitting a mental wall. I tried to think of something else as another thought came to me, but again, the same block was coming to me as it did. A new wave of fear began to rise up in me. For one, an entirely new reason, that the terrifying loop flying by outside, the speedometer showed 90, and then Craig spoke. Can I ask you a question, man? Ice filled every vein in my body, not at his question, but at his voice. It was different. Gone was the fear and tension he had not even a minute ago. Now it just sounded flat. No, not flat. I couldn't tell why, but the way his tone was, it almost made me feel like he was smiling. Another shiver cascaded up my spine as I finally forced myself to answer. My mouth dry as cotton. What? He answered as we began to fly under the streetlight. Are you scared? For whatever reason, the question made me turn to look at him just as the light whizzed over us. For a split second, the car's interior became illuminated. My eyes locked with his. The light flew by, the turnoff appeared again, and for a moment my eyes flicked up to see that a woman was right next to the road, bathed completely in the headlights. I finally caught a glimpse of her face. And then I was screaming. my fingers tearing at the door handle as the car swerved to the right, saw Audrey flying towards the windshield. I didn't think, I just forced the door open and leaped out. The ground rapidly flew up to meet me. Darkness. I woke up in the hospital room. A bandage covered my head and one arm in a sling. My chest felt like it was on fire as well. The first thing I saw was Vanessa, who upon seeing me wake up burst into tears, wrapped her arms around me. A few moments later the doctor came in. He told me I was a lucky man. Apparently I'd gotten away with a gash in my head requiring staples, severely bruised ribs, and a broken arm. Shocking for having dove out of a car at what appeared to be tremendous speed, he said, raising an eyebrow. Then he told me the police wanted to speak to me. He showed them in, and the two officers entered, asking me many questions. I told them exactly what happened, well, except for the two small details anyway. They appeared to take my account seriously and promised to look into it. We've had some reports similar to yours, sir. One of them answered tentatively. They told me how I'd been found, how a father and son who owned a gas station nearby had been out driving, had come across my destroyed Honda, which had wrapped itself around a tree and then some, and then lying unconscious in the grassy ditch, me. They didn't say who they'd been, but I had a fair idea who they'd been. At least the son, anyways. The night was 3 months ago. I've been at home resting and healing this entire time. Gives me plenty of time to think, plenty of time to process everything. I try not to think about that night, about any of it. I feel like I'd go insane if I do, especially after the police told me that they found nobody else at the scene of the wreck, only the passenger door hanging open. But I've had to. After receiving an email from an unknown address, one claiming to be the son, the kid I saw in the gas station that night, he told me things that his father told him he'd seen for years. That he didn't believe it all until that night when he looked out the door at my car. That's when he frantically called his father. As I type this out, I feel myself begin to violently shake, remembering the woman's face, indeed a ghost, as it flashed in the headlights. The look of horror plastered there as she frantically waved at me to get my attention. The same look the others must have had, remembering turning to look at Craig as the light flickered over and seeing the smile on his face. A smile wider than any human being's could possibly be. Filled with shark-like teeth, his black eyes stared hungrily at me. The same shark-like smile the kid told me he'd been flashed as I pulled away. But mostly I remember the single line of text Vanessa sent me. What caused me to rack my brain, trying frantically to recall my friendship with the figure sitting opposite me, and horror filling me as I realized I couldn't think of one single memory. What will keep me from ever taking late night drives again? The three words that will remain burned into my memory forever. Darling, who's Craig? I hope you all have enjoyed these two very scariest stories. We're going to move on to a creepypasta. Creepypasta. I loved those. I thought that was very good, the last one especially. I'm sure you've heard of the Ronald McDonald House. It's a charity. This is written by D. Kingsbury. So as we all have heard of the Ronald McDonald House, no doubt, they provide housing for families of sick children when they're in the hospital. Seems innocent, right? Well, there's another side to the charity. There's another type of Ronald McDonald House, and one that not many people know about. There's one in most big cities. You won't find it by looking for it. It doesn't have an address. It doesn't have a sign above the door. It doesn't even have windows. No, the only way you'll see it is if you're taken there. That's how I found it. I've never met my real parents. I've been in and out of foster families and group homes here in Detroit since I was a kid. I am now 15 and I'm what they refer to as a bad kid. Always causing trouble, always getting thrown out and placed with another unsuspecting do-gooder who thinks they can help. Poor old me. I always prove them wrong. My caseworker sat across the black metal table looking weary and frazzled. On the table between us was a thick letter-sized brown envelope, my case file. Well, your reputation has preceded you, she said. And now you only have two options. Military school in Lansing or the Ronald McDonald House, which has miraculously cleared you for acceptance. I didn't have the patience for drill sergeants at 5 a.m. reveille. And how bad could a halfway house named after a fast food clown possibly be? Ronald McDonald House it was. Dark clouds loomed above me the day I climbed into the back of the caseworker's town. My few belongings in the backpack and the clothes on my back. That was all I could take. One of those few belongings was a photo album filled with pictures of all the foster families I had been with. In some way, it was nice to remember some of them, even though I royally messed it up every time. I've had a few cases who went through the Ronald McDonald House, the caseworker said from the front seat. Things went so well for those kids, I never had to transfer them anywhere else. In fact, the house took over their case files and everything. We drove into downtown Detroit past all the family landmarks. I had been thrown out of one of the foster homes just outside town before I snuck into downtown Detroit with some neighbor kids to sneak into a dive bar. Good times. Well, here we are. The car came to a stop. I looked out the window. We had parked in front of a tall, gray, windowless building, sandwiched between two other industrial buildings on a narrow city street. I noticed there was an address on the building to my left and one on the right, but none on this particular building. Not even a sign. Are you sure? I asked, hesitating as I opened the door and climbed out to the back seat. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, clinging tightly to the strap, and followed the caseworker up to the windowless metal doors. She pressed a buzzer, spoke to someone inside, and the doors clicked to unlock. We walked in. As soon as the metal doors closed behind us, I noticed the pin-drop silence. It was sort of a silence that's so oppressive and empty it almost deafens you. Across the dimly lit lobby, there was a glass window with someone inside. A secretary. She was turned away, typing something intently. We walked over to the window. The caseworker rang a bell on the counter, and the secretary spun in her chair. Her face was painted like a clown, like Ronald McDonald, in fact. She even had the short, curly red hair. Otherwise, wore a typical white nurse's dress. I wanted to laugh at how bizarre his was, but I couldn't. A chill swept down my spine. I'm telling you, something was not right. I watched as a nurse and my caseworker interacted. Paperwork was passed through the window. The caseworker slid my case file under the glass as the nurse slid for some papers to sign. As my caseworker signed the papers, the nurse looked at me. Her smile should have been warm and welcoming, but all I saw in her eyes was hunger. I can't stay here, I stammered loudly. Take me to the military school in Lansing, please. What's the matter, sweetie? The nurse asked, her voice muffled slightly by the glass. Afraid of clowns? I looked into her hungry eyes. Now there was a malicious glint as she laughed. My caseworker laughed too, obliviously, and said, "Not now, don't overreact. You hate the military school. Besides, this will be good for you." "Yes," said the clown nurse, "this will be good for you." Before I could object, I heard a slam behind me. I spun around to see an open door in the far corner of the lobby to the left of the front desk window. There was no one there, just some light that flooded in. Then creeping shadows, shrill echoing laughter, and growing shadows along the wall inside the door. "Oh," said the caseworker, "here comes the welcome committee." As I stared in horror, clutching the strap of my backpack, my caseworker patted me on the shoulder for the last time. "Don't worry, honey. It'll be different this time. You'll feel right at home here. I know it." She turned to go. I felt a bile turning in my stomach. "No," I said desperately, "you can't leave me here." "Oh no, I've got to get going. I never did like clowns." And with that, she left me there. The metal door slammed behind her and I was alone. I faced the open doorway by the front desk again. The shadows had almost entered the room and the piercing laughter was filling the lobby with sound. I ran for the front doors. I pounded and yanked and pushed and screamed. Screamed for help. Screamed for my caseworker. Screamed for anyone, please, God. I turned to see the nurse behind me smiling at me again. Then they entered. A whole group of nurses. Laughing nurses with clown faces and red hair. Some were male, some female, but all had the same terrifying Ronald McDonald makeup, and in the dim light of the lobby I could see the glint of metal tools in their hands. Bringing up the rear was a pair of clown nurses rolling a metal table completely with restraints. "Get away from me," I screamed. I pounded at the metal door again. "Let me out of here." They surrounded me, grabbed me as I thrashed and screamed and tried to tear myself away. Laughed as I kicked and squirmed. They slammed me onto the rolling table and strapped me down. I looked around wildly. I was surrounded. "Let me go," I screamed, twisting and turning and pulling at the restraints. They rolled me through the open doorway and down a seemingly endless white hall. They laughed and laughed and laughed. They waved their shiny scalpels and razors and needles mere inches from my face. Just to make me flinch and scream, it made them laugh harder. The last thing I remember before one of them finally injected me was the hands. Gloved fingers prodded inside my mouth and pulled at my lips, distorting my screams and forcing an unnatural grin onto my tear-streaked, sweaty face. Hot face, and a whispered, perverted voice spoke the words, "We love to see you smile." Then, as the maniacal laughter seemed to warp and wind down like a dying record player, everything faded to black. I opened my eyes and was blinded by bright lights above. Shielding my groggy gaze from the fluorescent bulbs, I turned on my side and looked around. A cell. Tall, white walls covered in scratch marks and stains. There was a small drain in the corner of the door. Of the floor, my toilet, perhaps a door with no windows, and on the floor, by the door, my backpack. I tried to sit up. My body ached, and the moment I was up, my vision started spinning. I wondered what they drug me with. I realized I was shivering. I looked down. I wasn't wearing my clothes anymore. I was wearing a dirty, ripped hospital gown, bright yellow with a pattern of Ronald McDonald's head all over it. Nothing underneath. I heard faint, muffled sounds from somewhere in the building. It sounded like screams. I tried to stand, but couldn't keep my balance. My vision was beginning to stabilize, but my body feels still like rubber. I sank to my knees and crawled over to my backpack. Before I got there, I tried to open the door, and as I suspected, it was locked. I slumped onto the floor beside my backpack and unzipped it. All that remained inside was the photo album. They'd taken my notebooks and pens and cell phone, of course. They had. I wearily opened the photo album. Instead of photos that had been in there, one of myself with my previous foster families. Photos where I had attempted to look happy and hopeful, even though I knew I wouldn't be there for long. Instead of those photos, there were crime scene photos, and in each one I recognized one of my former foster families, brutally murdered and covered in blood. My heart raced and my stomach churned. I began to turn the pages quicker. Each page, a new photo, a new family, new carnage. I recognized their faces and the inside of their homes. I had lived with these people, and now they were all dead. I came to the last few pages. There was a photo of a house at night, then a window of that house, then inside the house a dark hallway with a light coming from one doorway. Then a photo of me caseworker brushing her teeth in the bathroom mirror. Then a photo of her looking at the camera in horror. Then a photo of her naked, covered in her own blood, contorted into an unnatural position in her bathtub. I turned to the last page, written inside the back cover of the photo album. There were 3 words. You never existed. I felt bile rise in my stomach. I threw the book to the ground, crawled over to the floor, and vomited. They were right. Having killed everyone who ever knew me, it was as though I never existed. I heard more faint screaming in the distance and knew I had to get out. I wiped the vomit off my face with my hospital gown and crawled back over to my backpack. Hopefully, they hadn't found my they were, flush with seam in the bag, nearly undetectable. The bins I used for picking locks. I told you I'm a bad kid. I leaned against the door and listened. I could hear footsteps approaching, but just as soon as they arrived, they faded in the other direction. I knew I had to work fast. I jiggled the handle with one hand and picked the lock with the other. It was surprisingly simple. Holding the handle, I slowly pulled myself to my feet. I could maintain my balance now. I pulled the door open just a crack. A clown nurse darted past. My heart almost stopped, but his footsteps didn't slow or change and soon faded. He didn't notice me. I poked my head out of the door. There were seemingly endless white hallways in either direction. The distant screams were louder now, coming from all around. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. I decided to go right. Passing doors identical to the one I had been behind, I heard screams and sobbing. I stopped for a moment at one door and heard the crying of a child inside. I jiggled the handle to see if I could let him out, but it was locked. I kept moving, looking behind me every few seconds to make sure no nurses ever had come into the hallway. Then I passed a set of wide double doors. I stopped again. The word "play place" was written in tall, thin letters across the width of both doors. I heard more screaming coming from within, the screams of multiple people and laughter, the insane shrill laughter of the clown nurses. I shuddered. I was afraid to find out what sort of torture was happening inside, and I knew I had to keep moving. I saw a door ahead with a stairway symbol and headed for it. As I opened the door, I glanced behind me and saw two clown nurses emerging from the playroom. Their white nurse outfits were covered in streaks of blood. I quickly shut myself into the stairwell, hoping they hadn't noticed me. The stairwell was dimly lit with cement walls and rusty railings. I looked at the door I had just closed. There was a red number 5 on it. I must have been on the 5th floor. I decided to go to the ground level. Each footstep echoed as I began to descend the stairs. I couldn't hear the screaming anymore, just a low, deep humming sound like pipes in the walls. It was a welcome respite. I finally came to the door numbered 1. The staircase seemed to descend a few floors lower, but I stopped here and slowly peeked through the door. More white hallways. No clown nurses to be seen. So far, so good. I stepped through the door and walked into the hallway. I noticed I couldn't hear any screaming on this floor. Just the buzz of the fluorescent tube lights above. I came to the end of the hallway. And another set of double doors, a large red cross, the kind you'd seen on a lifeguard stand or first aid kit, was painted across the width of them. I pressed my ear to one door. All I heard was a slow rhythmic pulse, like a machine at work, and faintly a beeping sound like you'd hear in a hospital room. Something told me I shouldn't have opened that door. I knew this wasn't the exit that I should keep looking, but I had to see. I turned the handle. It wasn't locked. I peeked inside. It was a cavernous white room. Fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed. I saw wires hanging all around and hanging from the ceiling in rows. Kids in hospital gowns like mine, attached to white wooden crosses affixed to the ceiling, crucified. crucified. They were silent, their heads drooping forward, their eyes either closed or staring at nothing. Some seemed to twitch a bit, but most were still. Their crosses swung back and forth very slightly, and the hanging wires, they weren't wires. They were intravenous tubes attached to the kids' wrists, tubes sucking out their blood. I almost vomited again right then and there. In the very center of the room, amidst the row of hanging crosses, I could see where the rhythmic pulsing sound came from, a huge steel cylinder which seemed to be collecting the blood from all the tangled tubes that dangled from the kids' wrists. I opened my mouth to screamed, cried in anger. All I could say was, what in the hell? That was when the alarms began to sound loud and piercing like the police sirens of hell. They must have realized I was missing. I shut the doors and frantically glanced around the hallway to see if anyone was coming. No signs yet. I ran for the stairwell. As soon as I entered it, I heard laughter from above, echoing and reverberating. The clown nurses were coming. I stumbled down the stairs as fast as I could. I must have gone another 3 stories before I reached the basement. I found myself running through a dark, sewer-like hallway with small light bulbs overhead, every 10 yards or so. The smell of decay and rotting flesh grew more and more pungent as I ran. The laughter continued behind me. I managed to glance over my shoulder. I saw a group of them running after me. I saw them come into the light. They then become silhouettes again, their smiling faces gleaming knives and needles pushing my adrenaline to the max. I ran past alcoves full of stacked, rotting corpses, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think of anything but escaping. I turned a corner and found myself facing the metal rungs of a ladder in the wall. I climbed up until my head smacked the ceiling. Below me, the shadows and laughter grew closer. Their footsteps slowed. They were close, and they knew it. I pushed the ceiling above me, heaving upward and panting and screaming. The clowns were below me, laughing and waving their scalpels. Something cut my leg. I screamed and pushed one last time. The ceiling gave way as a manhole cover slammed out to the asphalt above, a circular opening. I climbed out and frantically pushed the cover back over the hole, blocking out the laughter of the clown nurses below. I lay there on top of the manhole covered for a few minutes as I caught my breath. Rain fell onto my skin. The turbulent night sky above was a welcome sight. I looked around. Abandoned buildings, broken glass, no lights, no cars, no signs of any life at all. A police siren somewhere in the distance. Then silence. I climbed to my feet. Pain shot through my leg. I looked down and saw the cut on my ankle, where a clown nurse has slashed me. Bastards. Limping the best I could, I started to walk. Hello, I called out. The only answer was a distant roll of thunder. Somebody help me, please. My foot fell on something soft and smushy. I looked down. It was a newspaper. I peeled it off the wet asphalt. Most of the ink had faded, but I was able to make out the date. July 13th, 1992. I dropped it. An icy dread filled my stomach. I kept walking. Can anyone hear me? I screamed. Please, anyone, please. My words faded into delirious sobs. I stood still for a moment. hard as the wind blew that I saw a light in the distance. It was a big yellow M in the sky, a McDonald's, of course. I limped towards it. When I got to the place, I saw apart from the M, the rest of the building was completely dark. I walked cautiously towards the broken windows and looked inside. Darkness. I turned and surveyed the place outdoor playground and 10-foot-tall structure of colored tubes for kids to crawl through. Sitting at one of the benches, a familiar figure, the Ronald McDonald statue. You know, the one where you can sit beside him and it looks like he's got his arms around your shoulders. Every kid has seen it. I shuddered at the sight. The doors were unlocked. I walked in out of the rain. Silence. Darkness. I noticed that the decor wasn't like the modern McDonald's you see. It was the same as it was in the 80s with white plastic booths and real red and yellow tiles. The wind seemed to whisper through the broken windows. I noticed something on the floor. Counter. A black rectangle. I got closer. It was a laptop. A nearly new laptop. I let out a soft, delirious laugh, and I knew that I was what I was supposed to do. I took the laptop outside and sat beside the Ronald statue. I opened it and began to type the story. The rain is falling on the keys, but I don't care. There's nothing left to do now but wait. Because I've been noticing out at the corner of my eye, Ronald is trying to look over my shoulder. He's laughing now, and all I can do is join him. Okay, that was completely terrifying. By D. King Spurry. That was definitely one I had not heard before, and very good. I apologize for my dog snoring. Let's see, do we have time for one more? Let's see if I have one more. Waiting. One more. Bye does not sing. This is a Valentine's Day one, but I'm gonna do a whole creepypasta for Valentine's Day, so just this will be in addition. The perfect partner. I love Daniel. We are work partners, but nonetheless, my mind is similar to a movie where he is the main character. Ever since we started working together, I can't stop thinking about him. His face, his name, his everything. I have a desire. No, I have a need to be around him. Sometimes I think about how everything I care leads to him. Since the beginning of this year, I've forgotten friends, family, everything. Even my work is shit. The reason I do it, as every other thing, is to spend time with Daniel. It was a bleak Sunday while was him, and the moment he said we were arranging a work meeting on Friday February the 14th to discuss something I didn't care about, I cannot describe the sensation, elation, ecstasy, euphoria. All these definitions are laughable when compared to my feelings. My heart felt like blowing up all New York. The whole universe seemed to pay attention at this moment. Every word he said about the perfect evening that was about to come flowed from the telephone like maternal milk for a starving baby. All the other days were of restless tasks. I missed work a lot, for the majority of my time was used trying to make myself perfect for him. I learned every bit of information he liked. I spent hundreds on cosmetics, clothing, and other beauty accessories. I memorized thousands of jokes that would make him laugh. I corrected myself, shaped myself so that I would fit every criteria he could have to love me. Finally, Valentine's Day, our day, arrived. We were dining in a nearby restaurant as it was an emergency meeting. The company had some serious economic issues. I didn't care, as long as Daniel showed up. If someone saw me at that moment with ridiculously expensive clothing and jewelry perfectly applied makeup, though, he would have recognized the uninteresting woman that I was. I don't care what they think as long as Daniel notices. My heart was pumping hard. Butterflies fluttered in my stomach and sweat trickled down my forehead. Anxiety burned my soul from inside. Everything stopped when Daniel in his casual worn suit came in, ever so handsome, ever so perfect, with a woman. I was to stand up and ask who she was. Daniel told me it was Caroline, his girlfriend. Now, how can I describe the moment where everything falls apart? Your whole mind and soul wither away in an instant, leaving a hollow, silent void within. The others rose up with stupid smiles on their face to greet Caroline. I couldn't see exactly anything in her that Daniel would want that wasn't in me. He said I looked pretty, that it might have set me aflame in the past, but now I knew there was someone more perfect, better, that Daniel preferred over me. I still loved him as I never did, and so my being became divided in my ardent passion, my worship of his perfection, to ice-cold jealousy, envy, and hate of this woman. I doubt anyone ever felt hate like I did. It consumed me. It was bigger than my love for him, because this Caroline was an obstacle, a barrier that isolated him from me, and so I decided that the only way to have him was for me, was to be Caroline. I am disposable, unimportant. My identity is wordless to him, a gray streak in a gray canvas. Caroline outshines the rest. Caroline matters. Caroline can conquer his heart, make him love her. Caroline is perfect to him. And so, during this meeting, I approached her with a mask of sympathy and slowly befriended her. In a single encounter, I happen to know details of her life, where she lives, where she works, where her family and friends. This manipulation, this influence stems from my determination to be her. I cannot let any detail of who she is escapes. My resolve is iron, and so I steadily get her phone number. Over the next week, I invite her to go to the movies. I know she likes this one because she commented on it ever so much during our first encounter. carefully prepared my life to mimic hers, quitting my job, getting a new degree, turning my whole life into something else. I would be reborn anew. I didn't have any money nor courage to get plastic surgery as extensive as the one I needed so quickly. But still, my worthless, stupid self, I didn't think about making the original unwanted Caroline go away. So I took a sedative, among other items, on my bag and went on to our meeting. During the movie, which I don't even know the name, I stared nonstop at her, looked at that auburn hair of hers, so different from my black locks. Looked at those greenish blue eyes, so sweeter than my average hazel ones. Looked at that flushed, life-filled flesh in contrast to my pale skin. She was better in ways I could not dare attempt to describe. I stared at her so much my eyes watered, but that didn't matter. I needed to become Caroline. After the movie, I got us 2 cups of coffee, one with carefully mixed sedative. It took effect while I was driving her home. Her eyes fluttered, and she barely said anything when she fell. Over is the deep, death-like slumber. I stopped at my house and quickly carried Caroline to my small apartment, which was already being decorated in accordance to hers. No, my new taste. My mind was twisted. I hated her, this still living obstacle to my perfect love, this seductress, this succubus. She deserved so much more for her actions to corrupt and wound a love so pure, so sweet as Daniel's and mine. I loved him so much, and she was perhaps the most evil thing in existence. She hurt me and Daniel, and who knows, anyone else, so much. Someone needed to teach her a lesson to hurt her, just as she had hurt so many. Beneath this perfect face of hers, I was so sure that a monster laughed at us all. She had charmed and fooled Daniel. I needed to protect him and the rest from her. Someone needed to make justice. So I cut her a little bit. I got a knife and began to maim her. I flayed and lacerated her skin. I laughed like a child. It seemed so funny to the way this witch's blood flowed from her. It was amazing how it felt. No elation or ecstasy. All these definitions are laughable when compared to the sensation that I loved maybe just as much as I loved Daniel. Then I got an idea. I took the knife and slowly, so precisely began to take out her face, her mask of manipulation. When I removed, I laughed in triumph. She was ugly underneath, all bloody, with veins and bones. Joy and pride filled me. I had unmasked this horrible monster and showed the world, the wretch, how ugly she was. Her demonic eyes were dislodged, and she couldn't stare at me anymore, mocking my imperfection, for she was absolutely imperfect. She just pretended to be perfect. I'm sure Daniel won't like her like this. I screamed at her how her villainous manipulation was over. My love with Daniel was so perfect, would finally bloom. I hadn't bloomed in Valentine's Day, for this whore had fooled him for her false perfection. My perfection was true. I went to the mirror, still filled with the same amazing feeling of triumph that I put her torn face upon my own. that used this perfect face to hurt Daniel, but I would use it to please him, to fit in his definition of love. I smiled beneath her mask of a face. It was perfect, absolutely perfect. I am finally the perfect one for Daniel. Moving on to the next creepypasta. Creepypasta wiki at fandom.com. The children, they found a flower. Gross, don't touch it. Judith whined, recoiling as George prodded at the fleshy lump in the side of the cypress tree with a sharp stick. Little Thomas spoke up from beside her, pointing at the thing excitedly and smiling ear to ear. Look, it's moving. Sure enough, their discovery twitched in response, the fleshy hole in its center slowly beginning to open and close. It was an odd thing. The children knew at least that much. At least they knew that much. From a distance, it had just looked like a flower on a tree, but when they had gotten closer, they had noticed its peculiarities. For one thing, it had a mouth, a fang-filled maw that had seemed dormant up until this experimental stick poking. That in itself was bizarre, but during the children's inspection of it, they noticed that the throat of the thing on the tree seemed to stretch on for miles. A grotesque tube filled with teeth growing on and on, longer than it had any right to. This discovery was quickly shoved to the wayside upon closer inspection of the large pink petals the thing had. The mouth hole resting in the middle of what looked like a pile of tongues, each with many white protrusions. It had been Judith to notice what exactly the white shards were. Human teeth, seemingly growing out of the flesh of this meat flower. Judy was cautious of the thing as she was with everything. She did not understand, but George and little Thomas were excited and curious about this new discovery. There was no way she was walking back through that swamp alone. The boys laughed at the thing, enjoying the spectacle of the hungry maw twitching and burbling, some of the petals lapping at the air, many of the teeth retracting inwards. Every movement it made, Judith took a step back. It just looked wrong. She has always seen the same kinds of plants in the swamp outside the house, and there had never been anything like this in Father's flower books. Judith twirled a lock of brown hair in her fingers as George experimentally put the tip of the branch into the now gnashing gullet, dragging the pudgy, bespectacled child a few steps towards as the stick in his hand was chomped down on and pulled in violently. He shrieked, releasing the stick as the flower devoured it hastily. Splinters of wood flying through the air at the force. Those many rows of razor-sharp fangs were showing with every bite. Every one of the petal tongues lashed aggressively now, their many tiny teeth jutting out and wiggling violently as it mindlessly consumed the invading object. Little Thomas shrieked loudly, his shrill voice piercing the air and drowning out the sounds of the slurping and chomping. Judy and George quickly following suit and taking several steps back, eyes filled with a sudden and immediate terror at the sudden threat to their lives. Judith pouted, straightening her dress before stomping her feet adamantly, shoulder-length brown curls bouncing angrily as she made clear her displeasure. "I told you not to touch it. George, I don't like it. I want to go home." George fixed his glasses, puffing his cheeks out grumpily and giving a pout straight back at the younger female. He folded his arms across his chest. "Fine, you big baby. If you're going to be like that, we'll just leave you behind next time." "Yeah." Little Thomas piped up, mimicking the pose of the larger boy beside him and giving a sneer in Judith's direction. She blushed red and stuck her tongue out, taking a seat against another cypress and crossing her arms as well. The situation upset her, but not enough to warrant losing her playmates. George nodded a little. Thomas turned his attention back towards the unusual flower. He rubbed his chin for a moment. Pudgy fingers brushed across pale, freckled skin as he considered what to do with their discovery next. It was hardly moving at all, dormant, as it had been when they found it. Suddenly, little Thomas had an idea. "You want to throw a rock at it?" "Good idea." The two boys beamed. Judith opened her mouth to speak, then went back to sulking. If they wanted to get themselves hurt, who was she to stop them? They didn't want to listen to her after all. George and little Thomas dug through the dirt and grabbed the biggest rocks they could find, the larger child rubbing his sweaty hands on his stretched cardigan before taking aim at the flower. The rock loosened with more force than George had expected, bumping against the petals hard enough to leave a bruise on one. The oddity howled in pain, its wails echoing throughout the forest, loud enough to force the children to cover their ears. The teeth covering the creature's tongue petals seemed to bear dozens of them, nearly in danger of digging their way out of the bumpy flaps entirely as they wiggled and squirmed. The flower furious at having been struck. The pink organs flailed and thrashed hungrily, slurping maw, jetting out a long black tendril from somewhere in its chasm of a throat, and thrashing it in through the air wildly, desperately searching for whatever attached it. Little Thomas yelped and threw his rocks square at the flower, unable to think of anything else to do. Another gibbering howl sent the birds flying out of the trees, the long, shrill sound bringing Judith and George to their knees. Hands covered their ears. The youngest among them was not so lucky, however, his gaze fixed on the black tendril, his ears deafened as he watched it slow its flailing, the tip splitting and peeling back to reveal a milky white eye. More dripping tendrils began to form off the first, each one stretching out several feet before splitting to reveal eyes of their own. The monster's shriek had stopped, but little Thomas could still hear the ringing. 2 small pops, the only indication that the boy's eardrums had broken. His eyes strained on the curious, watching eyes constantly, multiplying as they slithered closer still. George called out to him, he thought, but his voice seemed a million miles away. One of the flower's tar-dripping tentacles surged forward, followed by what was now hundreds more, moving as a concentrated mass towards the little Thomas's face, the boy's eyes spinning round and round. Many drove down through his mouth, shattering teeth as they filled up his stomach, others filling into his ears, into his eyes. They moved clumsily, dragging him to the ground with some effort before steadily pulling the new meal in closer. Oily tendrils caressed his brain, and both Judith and George screamed in utter horror as they watched their friend smile, tiny hands clawing at the dirt as if trying to get closer to the thing on the tree, his eyes a pure white, and his skin pale as death as he desperately flopped himself across the dirt. Sobbing and wailing, George grabbed little Thomas's feet and pulled his once polished dress shoes, becoming caked in mud and dust as he strained with all his might. The younger boy's legs flailed and kicked in retaliation, gurgling angrily and hugging the cypress trunk as if it were the most important thing in the world. One of these kicks landed its mark, catching George in the face and shattering one of his lenses. Judith, still shrieking and holding her hands over her ears in complete hysterics. Little Thomas' happy burbles grew more frequent as he grew closer and closer to the flower, hands gripping the tongue petals reverently as he caressed the angry bone protrusions. They lapped at his little fingers, slathering them in a thick saliva as the tendrils forced his head into the gnashing tube of hungry teeth, leaking thick ropes of crimson down the ashen wood as little Thomas's skull quickly crushed. Beaming smiles still plastered on his face as the flower began taking bites from him. Judith hyperventilated, curled into a fetal position while George wailed, holding his bloodied nose. The sounds of slurping and breaking bone gradually faded, the two remaining children sitting in silence for several long minutes, even after the noises stopped. It had been Judith who looked upburst, streaks of tears running down her face, cheeks cherry red, and her breathing more than wheezing at this point. The flower was gone, as was the tree it had been attached to. Even the stains were gone. It had almost been as if it never happened. They had never run so fast in their lives. Written by Skull Munch. Moving on. 12 minutes. WSB-TV Atlanta 2 News. In the fall of 1987, local news channel WSB-TV2 of Atlanta, Georgia was attempting to fill a scheduling gap in their Sunday morning lineup. After a few solicitations by local business owners, they decided to allow young Reverend Marley Sachs to take the available hour block to a religiously themed show. It premiered October 18, promotion. The show was standard religious fare and consisted of the Reverend sitting in a simple chair reading passages from the Bible to the camera and discussing receiving a reasonable number of viewers, and continued to be shown into early December. It was then that the studio began to receive extremely strange complaints from the viewers of Words of Light with the Reverend Marley Sack. The calls were from women and women only, who vaguely referred to uncomfortable feelings they had at very specific intervals during the program. They described feelings of nausea, back pain, dizziness, and blurred vision. These callers, for no discernible reason, were convinced that it was the viewing of the program that was causing these symptoms. It was later determined after 3 weeks of complaints that these feelings were happening at roughly 12-minute intervals during the course of the program. The small studio staff checked all recording equipment, both audio and video, and found nothing faulty. When the Reverend was made aware of these incidents, he merely shrugged and stated cryptically that some can't handle the voice of God. The head of the studio, at a loss to explain the cause of these complaints, decided to continue running the program. By February, viewership had dropped sharply, and it was decided to pull the plug on the show. The studio had figured it would be more prudent to spend as much time as possible on the news story that had the other 2 local news networks abuzz: the miscarriage epidemic. Starting sometime in November, the number of healthy pregnant women miscarrying in the Atlanta metropolitan area had reached over 300. The CDC could find no discernible cause for this terrifying occurrence. The Reverend took the show's cancellation with what could only be described as abject indifference. When informed, he made no protest, merely nodded, almost knowingly. He left the studio after the last episode was filmed without so much as a word, and dropped off the face of the earth. No one ever heard from again, not his former congregation or any member of the church. The studio moved on, filling the slot with an infomercial, and continued to concentrate on the miscarriage story. A year and a half later, an intern at WSB Studios discovered the tapes of the Words of Light, began going through them in an attempt to find stock footage for an upcoming piece the station was doing on the impact religion had on the city. The Atlanta incident, as the miscarriage epidemic became known in medical journals, petered out 3 months after the studio canceled referenced Sack's show, and had already begun to fade from public consciousness. As the intern went through the tapes, he accidentally made a disturbing discovery about the footage. While attempting to stop one recording at 10 minutes and 45 seconds, he mistakenly jammed the fast-forward button down. While the footage whizzed by, he attempted to pry up the button with a screwdriver. Just as he succeeded, the tape stopped at 32 minutes and 1 second. The intern actually fell out of his chair when he looked up at what was frozen on the screen. The image of a badly decomposed, severed head filling up the entire frame. After he collected himself, he moved the film back a few frames, then forward, and realized that his mind was not playing tricks on him. He began going through the rest of the recordings and soon discovered that at exactly 12-minute intervals, the image would appear for 1 frame. Thinking it must be some practical joke, being played on the new guy. He presented it to one of the film technicians, ready to be mocked. The technician was just as puzzled as he. No one had touched the footage since the cancellation of the show. After the show had closed for the night, the intern convinced the tech to help him go through all the tapes of the Words of Light. They discovered every single episode of the same horrifying anomaly. They also realized that the show progressed, the image had become more disgusting. As maggots began to eat away at the loose flesh and pieces of hair and skin seemed to fall off exponentially. The tech made clear to the intern that what they were seeing was technically impossible, since the film itself showed absolutely no signs of splicing. And he himself had been at every filming of the show and knew of no time when this image could have been inserted into the frame. All of this was presented to the studio head, who, fearing some kind of backlash over allowing this to get on the air, ordered all tapes destroyed. He told the intern and the tech that he had no interest in knowing who did it at that point. Only that, covering their collective asses is all that's important now, he demanded that they mention this to no one. The tech easily moved on, remembering the incident as a darkly funny personal antidote. But the intern wouldn't let it go. He made copies of many tapes as he could before they were wiped, and took them to see if he could find anyone else, or anything else in them that might point to who did this or why they would. A week later, he attempted to rope the tech into helping him again, saying that he believed he had discovered something even more disturbing than the images himself. When the single frames were edited together in chronological order, the head's mouth appeared to be moving, as if trying to form words. The tech, fearing for his job, told him to get rid of the copies and not talk about it ever again. A week later, police responded to a 911 call made by an elderly woman in one of the Atlanta suburbs at dusk. She had heard horrible noises coming from her next-door neighbor's house, where a young couple lived. She told the emergency responder that the wife was pregnant and that she was terrified that something had happened. When the officers arrived on the scene 20 minutes later, they found no lights on in the windows and the front door ajar. They moved in slowly and made their way into the living room. Inside, they found a young woman dead, her abdomen slashed open. The wound was jagged and a trail of blood led from the body to the couch on the far end of the room. There sat her husband, the studio intern, naked, the corpse of his unborn child at his feet, dying. In his hand he held a rusty piece of metal, siding he had used to cut his pregnant wife. The television was on and playing an 18-second loop of silent footage of a decomposing head, mouthing some unintelligible words. The story at the police precinct to this day goes that the intern kept saying underneath his breath, over and over again as they led him away, "The light of God calls them." Written by Rob Oki, or Robo KY, however you want to say it, ROBOKY. That was pretty good. Moving on to our last pasta. This one is fairly long, so Happy Sun Daycare. just a few miles of my town outside of my town stood an old country house. It had been converted into a daycare, where parents would drop off their kids in the morning and pick them up in the evening. However, said daycare had been out of business for a few years now. There was a sign posted in the front of the yard, just a few feet from the house, that read, "Happy Sun Daycare," with a cute-looking cartoony sun painted on it. Within the fenced-off backyard stood playground equipment that had fallen into disrepair, began to rust. A slide, a couple of swing sets, some monkey bars, and a merry-go-round were once covered by swarms of children as they ran and played in the outdoors. They had since become perches for the local birds and squirrels and were swarmed by ants rather than children. I had decided to write a report on the Happy Sun's daycare for the news blog I work for. One thing, several people around today had gone to that daycare. I figured it might make for an interesting story to read about their experiences there, and if it affected their later life in any way. The other reason wasn't quite so innocent. There had always been concerns, parents who would fret over leaving their children in someone else's care. Was about that constant worry over how safe their sons and daughters were, especially with all the horror stories posted online about various daycare-related tragedies. For my report, I decided I would interview both employees and people who had gone to the daycare. As children, I wanted to get as many different points of view as possible so that it wouldn't seem too terribly biased. Of course, I agreed to not use their real names for the sake of privacy. The first person I interviewed was a middle-aged woman who looked after the infants at the daycare. For the sake of her privacy, we'll just call her Margaret. "What was it like working at the daycare, Margaret?" I asked. She replied, "Oh, it wasn't anything too spectacular. Just your typical day of working with children, or babies in my case." "I see," I said before I asked, "Have you had any problems while working there?" Margaret shook her head. "With the babies? Of course not. They could be fussy, but they weren't any trouble at all. The children were another story." This piqued my interest. Were the children that attended Happy Daycare too much for the employees to handle? Or could it be that there were cases of abuse going on that had been kept secret until now? I had to know. Margaret paused for a second. I thought that her apprehensiveness about speaking to me was going to end this conversation. But she continued. There were times when I heard muffled squealing. No, not squealing, screaming. And at first I thought it was just the children pretending to be scared. But the more I heard it, the more I realized those were screams that were real. That something was terrifying or possibly even hurting them. Did you ever see the children get hurt? Margaret nodded. Yes. Most of them were just the usual scrapes and bruises you'd expect to find on a child who fell while playing or bumped his head, trying to show off to his or her friends. Some of them, though, seemed off to me. Every so often I would see a child walk past on the way to the nurse's office, and each time time the child looked like he had been scratched or even bitten. Children scratched or bitten, that would be cause for alarm for anyone, I guess. Perhaps some wild animal had decided to make its home near the daycare, and curious children had gotten too close. Maybe a stray dog had wandered into the playground, and some poor unknown kid wanted to pet it. Were there any animals in the area? I decided to ask. Stray dogs, raccoons, perhaps a possum's nest? I doubted. See, pets weren't allowed at the daycare, and traps were set up at night to keep any wildlife away. There might have been a dog roaming around the area. Margaret shook her head. I pointed out, perhaps it was the dog that had bitten those children. Oh, I only heard the dog, she said. I never actually saw it, and I'd ever experienced was the occasional growl, snarl, or howl. So Margaret had only heard what sounded like a dog. I couldn't rule out the possibility that perhaps she had mistaken some noise she'd heard for that of a dog. Maybe she'd heard some children that were really pretending to be a dog and mistook them for a real one. Maybe she heard the wind and thought it was a howl. If that were the case, it would explain the scratches and bites she'd seen on some children. It wasn't too out of the realm of possibility that a child could have simply scratched their arm on a branch or part of their face by running into the fence by accident. With what sounded like a dog's growl to her, Margaret could have reached the conclusion that children were being attacked by some sort of stray canine. Still, I had to learn more about the daycare, with the possibility of a cover-up regarding a series of dog attacks. I figured the next person to interview would be a former attendee. Perhaps one of them would have childhood memories that could potentially shed some light on what Margaret had mentioned. After doing some background checks, I managed to find a young man who went to Happy Sunday Care when he was around 5 or 6. We're gonna call him Scott. I found Scott working at a local butcher shop. I had to wait until his shift was over before I could start the interview. Luckily, it wasn't too long of a wait, and it gave me some time to consider what to ask. Do you remember hearing anything about Happy Sunday Care? I asked. I know it was a long time ago, but perhaps you can recall something. Scott thought for a moment before replying. No, not much. I was only 5, maybe 6 when I went. I can remember just doing what kids do at that age. Playing, finger painting, watching cartoons, that kind of stuff. I nodded. Were you a good kid? Yeah, for the most part, he admitted. Occasionally I'd get into some trouble. Nothing too serious, though, just your typical kid fussiness. Not wanting to take naps, refusing to eat veggies, that sort of thing. I see, I replied, as I wrote down what he told me in a notepad. And was the daycare fair in how they disciplined you? Somewhat. All I forgot was a scolding and the occasional timeout. They made you sit in a corner for a few minutes until they felt you were ready to join the other kids, though. Though you were lucky if that was all you got, Scott pointed out. What Scott said baffled me a bit. They were lucky, how? I began to wonder if perhaps there had been more severe punishments for the more unruly children that attended the daycare. Could there have been some sort more controversial form of discipline that the employees at Happy Sun Daycare used that they didn't want to know to the public? What exactly do you mean? For a brief moment, Scott gave a shudder. He seemed to have recalled something from his childhood that potentially frightened him and affected his adulthood as well. The kids who got into real trouble were sent into the Grey Door. Scott heaved a heavy sigh. I've never been in there myself. I knew a few kids that had ones that would get into fights or throw huge tantrums. They'd end up going into that room. I don't know what happened in there, but they'd always come out shaking with wide, wild eyes. A few would break down crying. Some would scream. One kid even threw up before passing out. I frowned slightly. What sort of horrors had been conducted in the room that had been nicknamed the Grey Door? I then remembered what Margaret had told me and decided to check for a connection with her story and Scott's. Did the children have any scratches or bites on them? I asked. And did you hear any strange noises? He nodded. Yes, a few kids had scratches on them after they left the Grey Door, but I thought they'd gotten them before. And I just didn't notice them at first. They could have tripped or something. I did hear some heavy breathing. That could have just been some kid panting from running around. Hard to say for sure. First, Margaret said she thought she heard a dog snarling, and how Scott was saying he had heard heavy panting or breathing with the strange noises, mysterious scratches on misbehaving children, and the mystery of the Grey Door room. I couldn't help but wonder what it was that Happy Sunday Care had been hiding all these years. I thanked Scott for the time to speak with me before moving on to the next person to interview. With my curiosity regarding the Grey Door still heightened, I figured the next person to speak to should be one of the more troublemaking attendees of the daycare. I had to know more about what went on inside that room, and perhaps one of them could tell me. After doing more background checks, I managed to track down a young woman who we'll refer to as Alice. She had been arrested 2 weeks ago for spraying graffiti and was charged with vandalism. Rather than spend time in jail, she agreed to do 4 months of community service. From what I read about her records, it seemed this wasn't the first time she had gotten in trouble with the law. Were you always this much trouble? I asked her. Alice shrugged. Maybe. I wasn't sure how easy it would be to get the answers I wanted from her. She seemed like the type who would only cooperate if she'd get something out of it, like less time behind bars. I need to know about Happy Sunday Care, I asked her. Do you remember anything about the Grey Door? For a brief second, a hint of fear flashed in her eyes. Her face became pale as a few beads of sweat trickled down her forehead. That was a long time ago, Alice pointed out. I replied, surely you must remember something. Records show you were 10 when you attended. Are you sure you can't recall anything? Alice took a few deep breaths and began to regain her composure. If the mere mention of the Grey Door room was enough to put fear into her all those years ago, I couldn't help but dread what horror she could have experienced. Here was someone who had run-ins with the law, someone who had been arrested for various crimes, primarily theft and vandalism and trespassing, and yet it was something from her childhood that caused the most fear of being punished. Why? Okay, I'll tell you, but you gotta promise never to say that I told you anything. You got it, Alice sighed. I swear, I reassured her, I won't reveal any names. Everything will be strictly confidential. You see, I was playing outside in the playground, she began to explain. I remember wanting to play on the swings. Another kid claimed he had already gotten first dibs to play on them. Before I knew it, we were having a big argument. I lost control. Next thing I knew, he was on the ground crying. I must have pushed him when we were arguing. One of the teachers came up and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me inside. She told me that I would be taken into what the other kids called the gray door room as punishment. What was inside the room, I asked in anticipation. Alice took another deep breath and let out a shudder inside. The room, you see, was mostly empty. I remember the floor was nothing but dirt ground, and the only light was a dingy old bulb that barely lit anything up. The teacher just shoved me in and slammed the door shut. At first, I tried pounding on the door and screaming. I cried out for anyone to open it. It was so dark and cold. I was so scared, and I heard something. Something was behind me. I turned around, and I remember screaming louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. I frowned in concern. What did you see? It was a dog, or at least I think it was a dog. She took back a few tears. I didn't get a good look at it since it was so dark. All I remember was that it was the biggest and ugliest dog I'd ever seen. That thing had glowing yellow eyes, huge, sharp teeth. It was covered in black, shaggy fur, and before I knew it, it snarled and lunged at me. I ran around as fast as I could, screaming and begging for anyone to come save me. It grabbed onto my skirt with its teeth and tried to pull me towards it. I tripped and fell, but I managed to kick it in the face a couple of times to get it to let go. Then it lunged at me again, but luckily for me, the door finally opened and one of the teachers pulled me out of the room, slammed the door shut before the dogs could get me again. Or the dog. So there was a dog after all. The stories were all starting to come together. Margaret's story about hearing screams and growling. Scott's story about horrifying kids who had been sent to the gray door room. And now there was Alice's story about being sent to that room and attacked by some sort of large, vicious dog. I still had to know more. Why did they use a dog? Why did they cover it up? Perhaps the people working at Happy Sunday Care were afraid that such a punishment would be too extreme to use on children, or maybe they feared being sued by some animal rights group. I thanked Alice for her time and set forward to find the next person to talk to. Maybe it would be another one of the employees. If I was lucky, I might be able to get one of them to reveal the truth about what was going on in the gray door room. Once again, I began searching through the records of anyone who worked at Happy Sunday Care. It took some time to find someone who was willing to talk to me. Most former employees I asked were either too busy or simply didn't want to give an interview. A few of them directed various profanities at me as well. I couldn't tell if they were angry that I had learned about what was going on all those years ago, or if they were afraid of what might happen if they revealed any more secrets to me. Still, I managed to track down at least one person who was willing to tell me his experience working at Happy Sunday Care. Mr. Smith, we'll call him, worked as a janitor at the daycare back when it was still running. He had managed to get the job only because his aunt was in charge of one of the head offices there as well. However, Mr. Smith had moved to another town since the daycare closed years ago. This meant I couldn't interview him in person, so we sent each other emails instead. Mr. Smith explained that he had been dealing with some form of narcolepsy since he was a teenager, and history of sleepwalking as well. Doctors couldn't figure out what was causing his condition, but they couldn't find any other adverse health effects linked to it either. This still made it difficult for him to find work. He told me that he was grateful that his aunt managed to get him a job at Happy Sunday Care. I had so many questions, and while I wasn't sure which one to ask first, after I got his first response, I wrote back to him. I wanted to know how he was able to hold his job despite his condition. He was on medication for it. How did other employees and the children treat him? A couple of days passed before I got any response. I quickly opened the latest email response from Mr. Smith and began to read. He replied that his aunt would mix him a special herbal tea that would help keep his narcolepsy in check. She apparently strongly believed in herbal medicine and said that it was the better than any standard medicine on the market. Mr. Smith wrote about how the tea would be quite bitter and how he hated drinking it, but that he had to drink it if he wanted to keep his job, though on occasion his aunt would run out of the leaves needed for the tea and he'd end up falling asleep. This prompted another employee to go and make sure he didn't accidentally hurt himself or others. As for how others treated him, Mr. Smith explained in his letter that the children were generally quite nice. Most of them were just curious and would ask him a lot of questions. While he worked, a few would act as a nuisance, but he didn't really recall any of them being too much trouble. On the other hand, the other employees seemed to have a sense of uneasiness around him. He explained how he felt that they seemed extremely cautious around him. Also, he pointed out that his aunt always kept a close eye on him. He wasn't sure if this was due to his condition or some other reason. That just caused more questions to form in my mind. Why were the other employees uneasy around Mr. Smith? Was it because he was the nephew of one of the higher-ups, or was there another reason? And there was the matter of his aunt keeping a close eye on him. Maybe they were trying to keep the whole issue regarding the gray door room a secret from him. Perhaps they were afraid that he would find out about the dog and would contact the police. I had to know if he knew anything about the room. I quickly wrote a reply, asked if he knew anything about a large, empty room and children being attacked by some sort of dog. Another couple days passed. I got another response from Mr. Smith. I opened the reply and began to read. He said that he didn't remember any kind of dog at the daycare. In fact, he pointed out that animals weren't allowed on the property, and then he would set traps to keep the squirrels and mice out. His aunt was very strict about no pets being allowed as well. Most likely it was due to any potential allergies kids might have. Mr. Smith explained in his reply that perhaps the dog that Alice claimed had attacked her was just someone in a cheap-looking dog costume, and the room had perhaps been barely lit, so the kids in there wouldn't realize it was fake, and the scratches and bites were just the result of them tripping and accidentally scratching themselves. To my surprise, he had been in the gray room himself several times as well. Strangely, he pointed out that it was always when he hadn't any tea to drink. He would wake up in the room. He wasn't sure if anyone had moved in there, so he could sleep without being in anyone's way. Or if he had been sleepwalking again and just stumbled in there by mistake. Mr. Smith explained that the room was originally going to be a large storage closet for various arts and crafts related supplies, but it was never finished due to budget cuts. He wrote found in his reply that his aunt didn't want the area to go waste, so they decided to use it as a means to punish misbehaving children. In his opinion, someone probably bought a dog costume and would wear it while terrorizing any children sent into the room, as a means of instilling the fear of punishment. I sent one last email to Mr. Smith thanking him for taking the time to reply to my message. The whole thing about Happy Sunday Care was starting to come together. From what I gathered, via the various interviews from both students and employees, children misbehaved or sent to a large, empty space called the Grey Door Room. There was a dog, or possibly someone in a dog costume, that would chase children sent in there. Finally, said children would be pulled to safety before the dog could cause any serious harm. There was only one thing left to do. I was going to head inside Happy Sunday Care and investigate the infamous Grey Door Room for myself. I had to see for myself if there was anything that could solve this strange cover-up. Several minutes passed as I drove out into the countryside and towards the abandoned building. I parked my car in front driveway and took a few deep breaths. The front door was unlocked. Lucky for me, I gently pushed it open and began to look inside. The interior was dingy and covered in a layer of dust. Cobwebs spread over the various desks and chairs that hadn't been used in quite some time. A musty smell filled the house and mixed with the odor of feces and urine from the rats that now made the place their home. It was nauseating, to say the least. After I explored several different areas, I soon found the foreboding grey door that was said to lead to the dreaded room. The door was quite heavy, and it took me several tries before I managed to force it open. Just like how Alice described, the room was dark and empty, with a dirt floor and a dingy bulb. Said bulb had burned out long ago, so I used an old desk to prop the door open in order to see anything. I could see faint bloodstains on the ground and on the wall, but I couldn't tell who or what the blood belonged to. There were strange markings on the wall. I took a closer look and could have sworn they resembled claw marks of some sort. As I continued to examine the room, I noticed various footprints in the dirt. Many were faded or had been trampled over one another, but I could still make out a few. Most of them were the footprints of children. They looked like their makers had been running away from something. There was one other distinct set of footprints that caught my attention. I examined them closely. I could definitely make out the distinctive footpads, claws, and individual toes on at least one of the prints. This wasn't a person in a cheap costume. Happy Sunday Care had been using a dog to terrorize children. I had to let people know what they had been hiding for all these years. However, as I made my way out of the daycare into my car, there was one aspect about those footprints that made me uneasy. Since when